for the record, it does not help to ask the speaker if he has butterflies before he gets up and speaks. I want to thank the ICAA. You know, they've been supportive of our work from the very beginning, as well as supportive of so many of the talented architects here in this room. So thank you for having me here today. I'm going to leave that up a little while. It's a long quote to just absorb it a little bit. So, yeah, I wanted to start this talk, with this, our easy button. You know, it is so easy today to do anything with this in your hand, from ordering a meal to ordering a ride to, having a package show up on your front step to your next meal, to taking thousands of pictures and videos. It's all right here in this tiny package. But I have this picture of this craftsman here, and he has this look of satisfaction on his face. This is a craftsman in Maine. He wakes up every morning to work with his hands, his heart, and his mind. And if with this view of the world he could connect us on a human-to-human level, then perhaps maybe you will treasure his work. And it will mean something to you. And in turn, it will embody his spirit. And his life will have meaning. So what of this book? This book is not only about drawing, but it's how we see the world as architects and how we take that information and conjure a thing in our head. This idea that it's almost alchemy to bring an idea directly to physical form with this thing in my hand. And how today we've moved from a world of representation to a world of simulation. What are we missing? So I just wanted to say, because I'm talking about drawing, that doesn't mean that we're afraid of technology. In fact, we embrace technology. In fact, I thought, well, why don't I take and give AI, some prompts? I mean, what if I asked it, show me Michael Limber, an architect, an artist, a craftsman, a writer, in his studio in Maine. And this is really good. I know, the typewriter is ridiculous. AI almost got it. But there's a bit of a gap between what's in our head and what the machine gave us. And so that's a bit of the point of this talk tonight. I grew up in West Texas, and there's this Indian legend of the great creator, and when he created this big, beautiful world, he took all of his rubbish and threw it in a huge pile in the far reaches of West Texas. But this is what I grew up with. This is actually a painting by Dennis Blagg that hangs in the Museum of Contemporary Art in Fort Worth. And this painting is something like 12 feet tall and 32 feet long. And you stand in front of this, and it reaches deep into my sensory memories of West Texas. I stand in front of this painting, and I can smell the ozone and the sage. I can hear that distant crack of thunder, and not just a mere snapshot, but a cognitive impression of the spirit of the place. And so this place I grew up, there are these buildings that remain that still embody our history. It became who I am as a Texan, and it became a part of me as an individual and as an architect. These remote places where architecture and landscape came together. Not only about our history, but about our cultural memory, deeply rooted in our stories, in our lore, and in our mythology. How our buildings were built from the land and were of the land. It was an idea of Texas that made me fall in love with architecture. So, what does it mean for me to draw? In 2022, I was the Robert A. M. Stern visiting professor of classical architecture at Yale. And we working with George Knight, my associate professor there, we created this studio called The Land Between Borders. And it was to design this new Institute of Texan Cultures in San Antonio. And for this, we gathered the students and for a field trip, if you will. And we traveled 1,400 miles through Texas, through this zone that was at one time neither Texas or Mexico, but was this land in between, full of dynamic landscapes and diverse cultures. From the mouth of the Rio Grande near the coast, to places like Roma, Texas, to the hill country, and to Marfa and beyond El Paso. Exploring the many landscapes and cultural influences on Texas architecture. I handed each student a sketchbook to experience, to observe, and to draw, and to see, and to begin to understand this relationship of man and his buildings to the landscapes in which we lived. We drew to understand place and material, and to understand the twisted tree, and how that tree becomes a lintel, and how that lintel informs the character of a building. Many of these students hadn't even drawn buildings before, and almost none had ever drawn a tree or a landscape. But every place we went to, we brought these sketchbooks and we filled them with this knowledge and this understanding of place. And brought these sketchbooks back to the studio at Yale and to the architectural solutions that spoke to culture and to place. So, my love of drawing came from my childhood. I had an aunt by the name of Aunt Margaret. And when I was a kid, she lived at the end of Old Galveston Road, this oyster road that ended in the burned out bridge that had been destroyed in some hurricane way back. And she used to take us for walks down this old road through the swamp. And she didn't only teach me to draw, but she taught me to see. That she would point out, the orchids in the trees and the alligator nests and all the beauty within the swamp that not many people would ever see. And so, this childhood, was surrounded by this view of my Aunt Margaret and her view of the world as an artist. I also grew up around these books around the house. My father had these Humboldt Oil travel journals that were illustrated by Buck Schweitz. And there were these wonderful illustrations of Texas, how it existed in the 1960s. And were so evocative and so romantic, and how I thought the world was. So what of painting? Here we have a 15th century Botticelli as allegorical art, as a palimpsest, layers of cultural memory and meaning erased and rewritten time after time. Memories on top of realities, on top of memories. Renaissance on top of Florentine, on top of medieval, on top of Roman. This idea of Europe also shaped the American identity as well. Early American artists were using this European landscape and history and mythology as a basis for their art. Here we have Thomas Cole's Course of an Empire. But that all changed in 1836 with Ralph Waldo Emerson's short book, Nature. It was the #1 best-selling book in American history. As transcendentalism, we were at one with nature, and that nature was as close to God as we could come in life, and instructs us in every moment. This 17th century age of enlightenment, that we can only have knowledge through those things that we experience. The human understanding is based on an understanding shaped by the laws of nature. For American artists, like the Hudson River School, where human beings coexisted with nature, it was where the poetic and the artistic inspiration found no impediments. abandoning rationalism for emotion and feeling. Where landscapes rose like great cathedrals into the realms of light, where the deity seems to reside, a primordial image of American wholeness. This ideal relationship between humanity and all-powerful nature. Nature is God's refuge to the poet hero, and the idea that by observing, by seeing, one will know God and one will know truth. America was vast and full of possibilities, and this view of ourselves shaped a nation of brotherhood, humanity, and ecology. It showed the natural majesty during a time of American expansionism, searching for the balance between human expansion and the preservation of nature. Now, I think what's interesting is, if any of y'all have ever been into the Portrait Gallery in Washington, this painting is basically the size that you see on the screen here. And these artists used to come back from their paintings in the West, and they would sit in front of an audience, much like yourself, and they would draw the curtains open to view these great scenes of the American West. And so they saw this manifestation of God in nature. And paintings such as Moran's Yellowstone so touched the American spirit of who we are, it created our first national park. Other aspects of our society were depicted, such as the tempest of the Civil War and the bridges that we would have to build once again to become a nation. Literal themes that drove Winslow Homer's work. But for Homer, it was not only about what he was seeing, but it was about the obsessive, constant search. American artists carried on this tradition into the 20th century. Here we have N.C. Wyeth with what John Ruskin called measuring the moods of nature. So, this painting belonged to a client of mine, Linda Bean, and I was up in Maine one time, and I called her up. I said, Linda, I'm in Maine. I'd love to see you. She said, okay, be down at the dock at Port Clyde at 8 a.m. And so I showed up at the dock, and I got there a few minutes early, and I was on the dock. And 8 a.m. sharp, I hear this diesel engine coming across the harbor. And there's this lobster boat just hauling straight at me, just beelining straight at the dock. And just as I was literally about to dive into the water to miss it, it shuts off the engine and does this perfect pivot and just kisses the dock. And there's Linda Bean, 84 years old, at the wheel, and says, hop in. So we go out to this island that she lived on, and she takes me directly to this painting in her entryway. And I'm standing there just awestruck by this painting. She said, okay, now look to your left. And she had purposely left her front door open. And I looked to my left, and there, out in the harbor, is Black Spruce Ledge, the subject of this painting. But it was also interesting in that Linda had this piece of paper in her breakfast room, and there were like 25 dots around this paper, this outline of the island. And with each dot was the name of a painting and a different Wyeth that had happened on this particular small island. This is one of those paintings, the Island Funeral, painting of Teal Island. And this hung on her fireplace. And again, another large painting. This is probably something like 6 by 8, big painting. And it just absorbs you into it. But what was really interesting, you go on the other side of the fireplace, and this hung. The beautiful study for that painting. So, these regional modernists like NC, it was the study of the intersection of the forces where sea met the land. And that relationship between that landscape and man that shaped our American culture. So this island, Monhegan, Maine, was an artist colony that housed Artists like Rockwell Kent, Edward Hopper, all of the Wyeths, and George Bellows, among a few. George Bellows' father was actually an architect. Here we see Edward Hopper seeing the landscape not as a collection of objects, but of blocks of color. Most importantly, Edward Hopper's aesthetic strategies, synesthesia, or a cross-century imagery. That ability, what Walter Wells says of artists, to have us taste what we see, hear what we feel, to give orderful color, melodious flavor, or a chill wind perceived as a wailing siren or a quivering blue light. Hopper was so good at this, he was known as the poet of silence. He was able to paint the loneliness of place. What if architects could think like these artists and convey these feelings in their buildings? English art critic John Ruskin said, "To draw is to gain an empirical knowledge, an understanding through experiencing. To draw the leaf is to know the forest." And so we had artists such as Charles Platt in the New England Art Colony in New Hampshire, who lived and studied in the Cornish Art Colony with Maxfield Parrish and studied in the Académie Julian in Paris. He would soon change his placard from artist to architect. He would develop the first measured drawings of Italian gardens and went on to work with Frederick Law Olmsted. At the turn of the century, Platt would become America's most celebrated architect. We had other architects such as John Calvin Stevens. Here we see Stevens' painting kit. That Stevens wouldn't merely paint landscapes for the sake of art, but as an almost ceremonial seeing of the site. He was obviously the natural choice for Winslow Homer's own studio in designing his studio in Maine. And so what was interesting about this relationship between John Calvin Stevens and Winslow Homer was that John Calvin Stevens, instead of asking for a fee, asked Homer if he could have one of his paintings. And so it is said that Homer, so impressed with this, gave him a painting of his studio in the fog. So Stevens was instrumental in this drawing culture in the Northeast. He would go around saying, "Do you sketch?" He would ask other architects, "There will be no shortage of opportunity to improve your skills." This was so important to Stevens that he gathered other architects around to paint with him. They called themselves the Brushins, friends like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Robert Swain Peabody of Peabody and Stearns. These architects were the first to formulate the first true American architecture in the shingle style, an architecture at that intersection of man and nature, built of the materials of the land, wood, shingle, and stone. And so all of this idea of what it meant to be an architect began to center in Boston. And it would end up forming America's first architecture school based upon art and science, this intersection between the two. That would be MIT. And its first professor of drawing would be Samuel Chamberlain. And soon American journals would encourage drawing and documenting travel beyond. And they would become the journal for the drafting room, encouraging members to contribute studies of their observations abroad to become the nucleus of the American architectural practice. And that the learning of language in place was the basis of knowledge for architecture. MIT students like Cass Gilbert and the seeing and the understanding and the knowing. Or Julianne Francis Abel, the first Black American to graduate architecture school at the University of Pennsylvania. And another University of Pennsylvania grad, John Kell, who would go on to win the Henry Gillette Woodman Traveling Scholarship in 1931. When I came to San Antonio, there was this old man sitting in the back of the drafting room, and all he did was check red lines on drawings. And he'd sit there all day, wouldn't say a word. And later I came to find out that this was John Kell, and that he never spoke of this past life of his. He felt like the world had moved on without him. And it wasn't until he died that his family gathered up some of his sketches from this scholarship and put together a book. And these are just a couple of those beautiful paintings from that. But he had come down to San Antonio to oversee Paul Cray's federal building. And a funny story there is that his desk mate, Louis Kahn, was let go when things got slow, and he was retained. So, this idea of Ralph Waldo Emerson's book would continue in California and would have an impact. We had Joseph Worcester establish the arts and crafts movement, influenced by Jack London's Call of the Wild and his good friend John Muir's musings of nature. And here we see his house in Piedmont, what is now in the middle of Oakland, California, quite a different scene today. But he also boarded a young architect by the name of Bernard Maybeck at this house. Here we have one of Bernard's drawings. And so MIT graduate John Galen Howard would embrace this ideology as well, and would take this idea of nature and drawing to the West Coast. And we would become the first head of the school of the architecture school at Berkeley, where he would teach luminaries like Julia Morgan, the first woman to attend the École des Beaux-Arts. And there would be Mary Coulter, who as a child collected Indian drawings, hiding them from her mother, who burned anything Indian, fearing smallpox, would take these drawings and these mementos and go on to create some of the architecture that defined the West unlike any other in cities like Santa Fe and throughout the Southwest. You would have Bertram Goodhue, drawn from New York to Boston by the young artistic intellectuals of the Society of Arts and Crafts. He would then travel to Mexico, write a book in his early 20s called Mexican Memories, A Slight Sojourn South of the Yellow Rio Grande, where these studies would become influential as he would replace Irving Gill as the chief architect for the Panama exhibition in 1915. And he would reinforce this new concept of regionalism and a recognition of culture and landscape to American architecture. This idea of a regional identity took hold with architects like George Washington Smith, who built what 1925 Architectural Digest called a style of architecture that has become peculiarly characteristic of California. But George Washington Smith didn't come to California as an architect. He came to exhibit in the 1915 exhibition as an artist. George Washington Smith also attended the Académie Julian in Paris and would paint with George Bellows and exhibit with him at the fair. So I really wanted this painting in my book. And I called around, I found the gallery that had this, and they had sold it. And I said, could you please give me the name of the owner so I can contact them, or can you reach out to them and have them contact me and see if they would allow me to use this? And they said, no. So, which was understandable. But we have an office in Santa Barbara, and I was touring a house with the builder looking at his work. And I came around this corner in this hallway, and here it was. And he said, "Oh no, the clients would be happy to have you let you use this painting in your book." And well, the book's already out, so thank you. The beautiful painting, by the way. But this is also Little Maria Riggs' drawings for George Washington Smith. These incredibly evocative drawings. This is actually for the Maverick House in San Antonio, Texas. There would also be another young architect by the name of Lionel Preece. After Santa Barbara's earthquake in 1925, he was instrumental, along with George Washington Smith, in rebuilding the city. But Preece didn't just invent this architecture. It was an architecture that was deeply influenced by his experiences in travel abroad in Europe, as well as his travels in Mexico and the deeply romantic expressions of the villages of Guanajuato. But these were also influenced by the landscapes of modern regionalists like Georgia O'Keeffe and Marston Hartley. Lionel Preece would go on to become the director of the Art Institute of Seattle. So, to take a photo is merely a transference of data, capture versus response. To draw it is to absorb it into my memory and to make it a part of who I am as a person and as an architect. And so, as I travel abroad, I bring a sketchbook. Often these sketches aren't good. They're just quick impressions, like this painting of Venice at 2 a.m. with jet lag. Just a quick impression. Or later, after I've recovered, of the Grand Canal, Santa Maria della Salute, another sketchbook sketch of Villa Capra, Villa Rotonda, Vicenza. Sometimes it would be sketches of the inhabitants of a place, but more often elements of a place. But it wasn't just this idea of an object and trying to capture an object. Here we have this bridge in Provence. It's a mnemonic moment. It's sitting here sketching, feeling the heat on the back of my neck, the smell of lavender from the adjacent field, and the song of crickets sending an electric current through the air that creates a memory of place. Another painting of Provence. And other sketches throughout travels. A quick sketch of a subway station or a subway entry in London, or from the hotel balcony of the Acropolis in Athens, or a church in the Bahamas, or a dovecote in France, and how those begin to influence our very work. Here's a beautiful watercolor by my partner, Mac White, of a library that we ended up designing after this dovecote. I was told to slow down on these. We have slow readers. So studying these landscapes plays a large role in my practice. Just a few miles north of the Rio Grande, I was questioned by Border Patrol twice here. What are you doing? Rio Grande, River Gorge, north of Taos. Preparatory drawings, feeling the landscape, understanding the landscape before designing a project. This is South Padre Island. And this is a hillside prior to designing a house in West Texas, and the view that the house would be looking out upon. These are just small sketches. Some of these are. This is a small one. And then the house that we were designing on that site. And then that house becoming a part of that landscape. This was a quick sketch in the panhandle of Texas. And this tower that the client wanted. But it wasn't, merely a tower. It was also, he wanted to be able to go up there and watch these, what we call these great blue northers come blowing across the plain. But he was a smart client. He also wanted his storm cellar that he could run down to when he got scared. And he was really smart because that storm cellar doubled as a wine cellar. So here's a sketchbook I like to use a lot. I mean, this is a fairly big sketchbook. You see the line of the page in the middle. And this is a quick watercolor of Moosehead Lake up in Maine. And then the design for a lake house on the banks of that lake. And then the realization of that lake house nestled within the landscape and becoming a part of the landscape. This is a project about an hour and a half drive west of San Antonio. San Antonio, if some of y'all don't know, it kind of sits on the edge of civilization. It's about, I think, 800 miles to California from there, and there's nothing in between. So this was a painting of the landscape where we're going to build this ranch house in. Initially, the client wanted you to build the house up on this bluff over a river, looking west over this plain, and we said, no, you need to build on the plain, looking at the bluff. And so we built this house. And this idea that this house connected to the land in which it was built, both in form and materiality. This is the front entry within a courtyard. And you enter that courtyard through this what we call a zagwan. But all of the materials were meant to be as though they'd come off the very ranch on which we were building. Oak for the beams, cedar for the roof, and even the columns. A team floated down the adjacent river for 5 miles to retrieve these cypress trees to use as columns. And then here you see the interior of the space and that very view that I'd painted before. And then just quickly some of the interior of the house as you move through it. And the library built out of ancient cypress. And then a small cottage we had intended on building up on the bluff where he had originally wanted the house. And so these landscape paintings become the nexus for the conceptualization of these projects. Here we see another sketchbook sketch of a view in Aspen looking at Hayden Peak. And this is a more modern project of ours, but that very view through the windows. Sometimes we don't have the luxury of standing on a beautiful site in beautiful weather. This is in Telluride, standing in 2 feet of snow, trying to get an impression of the landscape. And then the house nestled within the landscape. And then, these other studies of houses that begin to take on the form and the spirit of their place. This is in Montecito on the ocean. And outside of Austin in Texas. And in this case, this is a house that sits adjacent to a state park in Texas, on what's called the Pedernales River. And on this river, I was walking the banks. There was this cypress tree that just clung to the banks, these roots reaching out for almost 20 feet, trying to grab hold of the earth. And so that served as inspiration for this ranch house sitting on the bluff overlooking the river and kind of clinging to its site. This is the interior. And so it was mentioned that we do work in other places. This was getting into Spain at 2 a.m. and not being able to sleep and painting the Spanish hillside town, Arcos de la Frontera, in the moonlight. And then the following day, beginning design on a street for housing in a new village. This is a project in Scotland, trying to understand the place. And so early on, we became this kind of architectural hitman for these master planners that were going in, trying to understand the architectural character of these different places and we were to come away with this language that they would code into the final communities. This is in the Bahamas, and this is a housing unit in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. And so these charrettes, we would do these very quick intensives. Some of y'all don't know what a charrette is. We have just a couple of days where we would get with the client. It's like being in the trenches, and you would begin to understand their program and what their needs and their vision is, and just begin to draw. And so this is quickly showing, how some of these initial concepts, like this concept sketch for a seminary in North Carolina, becomes the actual project in and of itself. This is as we get into schematic design and the project begins to take hold further into schematic design. We begin to really understand the materiality. This is one of Mac's beautiful watercolors here. And then, beginning to realize the building itself. And this is phase 1 is built. We're working on phase 2. And this is Mac's beautiful watercolor of the interior of the chapel that we're getting ready to start constructing. Another charrette, the University of Arkansas, quickly coming up with this idea, that this is what we envision working with the client on this corner, going into schematic design, and then the realized actual built building, very, very close to that initial vision, that initial spark that we had in those intensive workshops. This ended up leading us to another charrette for the same sorority in Ohio. And then this is the project that we did for Linda Bean. Linda passed away this last year, never saw it realized, but Mac White just received a Trumbauer Award for this project last week. But this was the initial concept sketch during the charrette, and then our design trying to marry this large reception hall with this residential charactered institute, and how we began to shield that and bring it together. This is the true scale of the lecture hall on the downhill side, and then just some interiors. But often, these charrettes would be just about trying to understand architectural language and trying to decipher what a place can be. This is for Windsor, Florida. This is for a project in Austin, Texas, for the University of Texas, for an office park. And then sometimes you have places like Costa Rica that has no true architectural heritage, so what do? You have to imagine what fits the landscape itself. How do you capture that landscape and begin to realize something that had never existed before but should? And so then this is the built building or the house on the edge of the jungle overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It was for a project in Montana, looking at a series of experiences as you move through the forest up towards the main lodge that then overlooks a bluff and overlooks Glacier National Park and Flathead Lake, and then some of the stable drawings, and a cottage in the orchard. And so these would start out as these sparks, these images in our minds that we begin to, with pencil and lead, etch out onto paper and begin to tease out into an understanding that this could be a built form within the landscape. This is in Telluride, my final pencil drawing of the schematic design of a lodge. This is a very recent project. We just presented this to the client a couple weeks ago, but this project on the Colorado River in Colorado, and beginning to feel this understanding of how this house set on this precipice at this elbow of the river, and create this kind of courtyard space that the client was looking for. But it's not only an understanding of what it looks like, but it's an understanding of how the architecture begins to come together the series of experiences, the spaces, the forms, how those all relate to the views and the elements of the landscape, and then how that sits on site. And then, finally, this is a drawing that I did just to understand the materiality and understand the size of the stone and the texture of the rock and how it would fit into the landscape. And these aren't just drawings for the sake of drawings, but we often, even in construction, go back to these initial drawings when we're doing mock-ups and say, yeah, this is the spirit of what we're trying to achieve. And so these conceptual drawings and these schematic drawings, that spirit is taken through the entire process to build form. This is a project in West Texas overlooking the prairie, and the initial conceptual sketch of a tower as it began to look out towards that view. And then me beginning to think about the materiality of that tower and how it would relate to the landscape. And then, this house as it began to be realized. These are very recent pictures. This house just recently got completed. But understanding the feel and the texture and the connection of the stone to the landscape. This stone actually was quarried just a half mile down the road from where this was built. This is a project that thankfully was not harmed during the fires in California, but this is in Flint Ridge, La Cañada. Conceptual drawings for this house, and apologize, we haven't shot this yet, but these are some iPhone shots of the realization from drawing to built form. And then this is a house, this was a project we had in Mexico, and we get out to the site, and there's this beautiful view of the Sea of Cortez, and then really nothing else except for this giant pile of boulders on our site. And you see this one on the one side that has this cave kind of wind etched out of it. And so that pile of boulders served as the very idea of what this house could be. This idea of being on top of and the through and the around, almost like a playground of form and spaces. So the initial design drawings of the house. And then that house as it was realized on top of the hill becomes a series of experiences informed by the landscape. The entering, the around, the through, the on top of, and the within. So we talked about the Brushens earlier. A lot of people have kind of heard of, honestly, we have a cooler name, the Whiskey Watercolor Club. Of a couple members here tonight, Tom Kligerman and Doug Wright, but there's also Enki Barnes and Steve Rugo. And we found ourselves traveling together. We sit on these different boards and we go on these travels. And we started taking our sketchbooks and started sitting and drawing, and really found this camaraderie and understanding a place through drawings. And so began to draw more and more as we went on these trips. And we had this trip planned to India, and we said, well, let's all take our watercolor kits and we'll plan on taking time to really paint and to draw. And so it was an amazing adventure. We all took these watercolors, these sketchbooks. Some of them were simple sketches, like this is a sepia pen with just blue paint to get the impression. Some were more studied. This is Tom's exuberant painting of Holi, the celebration, the Indian celebration. Other paintings that I had done. But all of this came to a sudden stop as the president shut down travel internationally. And we were threatened with being stuck in India. And so none of us really relished the idea of spending weeks at a military encampment in India. So we all found our flights going home, and we asked, well, we're just going to go back and be remote, and everybody's going to be working from home. This was so enjoyable. What do we do? And so Enki's wife said, well, why don't y'all just Zoom every Sunday and paint? And so that was the birth of the Whiskey Watercolor Club. And so, what are we going to paint every Sunday? So we decided, well, let's paint the masters. And so, we started looking at artists like John Singer Sargent and, studying, how does John Singer Sargent paint the luminosity of canvas? And so this was my painting, copying one of his paintings. Or, Francis McComas and his blocks of color. Or Augustus Osborne Lampo and how does he capture atmosphere? Here's a painting of Hog Falls by Fritz Thalo. And three of our studies, you have Steve Rugo, who's really studying the atmosphere of the painting, and Enki Barnes studying the movement, and myself studying the transparency of water. Well, we thought the pandemic was done, and so we all planned a trip out to Santa Fe, and it turned out it was just a brief reprieve. But we go out there, and all of us were able to paint together again, and really begin to do our own capture of the landscapes for the first time in some time. Here's my painting of an adobe. Here's Doug Wright's painting of the same adobe. Both different, very different impressions of this place. And what we learned very quickly from coming out of our studios and going back into the landscape is plein air has its certain challenges. Here we are sitting in the desert, painting, and we mix our paints and go over to make a stroke, and you go back to reach to the palette, and your paint's completely evaporated. Versus later travels to like Ireland, where it's drizzling on you as you're trying. Watercolor doesn't work very well in the rain, but dealing with these different atmospheric conditions. And then lastly, we were all in October. We were in Italy, and different impressions of the different places we spent in Italy. This is Perugia, one of my watercolors, and then this is Doug Wright's beautiful impression of Ravello and Tom's amazing watercolor of Rome. What was interesting about that trip is we really got out of our shell, and for the first time did some figurative paintings. We were able to paint with Wendy Arden, a Rome artist, an American artist in Rome, I should say, and she brought down a model, and so we were able to paint figures. And these were really interesting exercises in that we just had mere minutes. I think these were 20-minute exercises. She wouldn't allow us to draw. We just had to paint. We had to take the brush and follow the form, follow the light. And so it was a real experience and really teaching us to be more direct between our mind and the end of our hand and the end of our brush. And so when I arrived in Rome, the left side for you, I drew out Piazza del Popolo, and then I washed it with watercolor when I had first arrived in Italy. And as I left, I had ended up just painting without drawing. And so it was a real education in that intuition. Testing to see if you're really reading. So I'd always wanted a studio up at my place in Maine, and this is what I imagined. And I didn't get that. I got a room. But for the first time, I was able to paint landscape for the sake of understanding landscape, not for a project, but just to understand it. This is the view outside of my window and my studio. This is a quarry just down the road where I got to do a couple of studies. And the wonderful thing is the studio was done right at the beginning of the pandemic. And so all of a sudden I was spending more time there and now able to really paint for the sake of painting. This is a lighthouse around the corner, harbor in Camden, winter scene. And each drawing from nature begins to train my eye in an understanding of the environment, and where you begin to learn from nature about color theory, perspective, light, composition, translucency, reflectance, pattern, texture, form, complexity, and atmosphere. And this was one I just did last week while I was up there. So our office takes drawing very seriously. Every Friday, our office takes 20 minutes in the back room, and everybody sits down to do a quick sketch. Even our gal in marketing sits down to sketch with everybody. And so it's this constant repetitive training of that direct. It's almost like a learning a language, becoming fluent at it, and to lose the translation. The drawing skills began to come way up in our office. And so some of these quick studies that they've done in the back room and how those have translated to their studies outside of the office. And then you see Jim, as a project manager doing his drawings. This is for a project in Ohio, in the Appalachian Mountains. And then this is again, going back to one of my studies for landscape. This is a project in Montecito, where I'm studying and trying to understand the relationship of this large site to the land and to the views. This is one of the studies I did. The other study faces the ocean. And then beginning to design for that site, specifically for that site. This is also, besides the view, we had an Olmsted reservoir in the middle of our site. And in this instance, going through the series of explanations to the clients about these series of experiences, and approaching the house and going through these moments and what the architecture captured, both in terms of space and view. And there are dozens of these drawings that we've done. These are just a few. This is the caldarium down below the house in their spa. And then the final layout of the house itself. This is a master plan for a church complex in Florida. And then a master plan for, this is a recent project, a master plan in Michigan for a small college. And us looking at the previous architects' techniques for describing master planning. Another one of Mac's wonderful drawings of a hotel we're doing now that we're in schematic design with. And then, this understanding that this not only teaches us to draw better, but it teaches us how to see better and how to convey better. And these are actually computer drawings here. This is a library that we're beginning construction this month on at this college. That's the front, and then this is the rear as these monumental steps where students will come down for convocation. And then a computer drawing showing the undercroft where the students will pass through from the quad down those monumental steps. And then just to show you, we are in the process, this is a mock-up for all of those vaults of using freestanding masonry vaults without formwork. It's actually a combination of using the Mexican tradition of bóveda with Guastavino tile. And so there'll be 2 layers as these get built up. And then, looking at an understanding of your different architects of the past, and how to illustrate different views within our work for the school. This is a grand staircase. This is the main reading room of the North Library. A node connection between the North Library and then the South Library, which we are in design development on right now. And then a rendering of the interior space of that building. And then even playing with the computer and getting this spooky kind of Joseph Gandy look to the interior. This is a project in Florida where we're using the computer to create a Viennese type Otto Wagner effect for the rendering. And then this just a few weeks ago at the project while it's beginning to get completed. It's another computer rendering of a tennis pavilion in Missouri. And then, does anyone recognize this artist? It looks very much like Lutyens' right-hand render of William Walcott. But in fact, this is not William Walcott at all. This is an AI-generated drawing. And so, yes, it's evocative, and yes, AI is improving and can we can do amazing things with it, like we can with any tool. But as I sit here in the valley outside of Santa Fe, and I sit on the red dirt, sun on my back, I hear the high hawk calling, and I smell the cedar and the sage, as I imagine a home that will forever marry with the spirit of the land. That's why I draw as an architect. Thank you.